Boeuf Bourguignon, French beef stew in red wine. We're going to serve it with braised onions and mushrooms and a wine dark sauce. It's a perfectly delicious dish. I'd better taste.
Today I'm going to be talking about the history of beef bourguignon and my connection to it. However, it has a long history and my personal connection is through several people, including my regional expert Vanessa Carrington, which you will hear and see throughout. However, before we get into my connection, I want to bring the history of the dish and wine into perspective while you watch me cook.
I think that French food that makes it outside of France is viewed as haute cuisine, like very fine cuisine, and that's what the French are known for. But when you dig deeper and you go to France and you live there, you realize that a lot of these dishes are actually peasant dishes. This is like bare bones, and it's also very regional. So Boeuf Bourguignon is going to come from a region where there's red wine. Bourguignon.
The transition from peasant to haute can be tied to chef Auguste Escoffier's Le Guide Culinaire published in 1903. Escoffier's book popularized what can be known as gourmet cooking, which generally refers to some version of French cuisine. The popularization of beef bourguignon through Escoffier's book was made possible by the intersection of la grande cuisine, cuisine of high establishment, and gastronomy, which moved food away from palaces and into restaurants. The French Revolution furthered the movement of food from restaurants into the home, as restaurants' ambiguous ties to the aristocracy were blended with ideas of democracy. His book helped bring knowledge from cooks in restaurants to consumers directly and allowed them to cook the style for themselves. However, the refinement of French cuisine is not limited to just food. Wine similarly went through a period of transition.
In France, the expectation is that all wine should be good and it should not be expensive. So their palate for wine, while there are excellent bottles of wine and there are expensive bottles of wine, they don't expect to pay very much. They do protect their wines and their names and that region that they come from. That is a national pride for them, their wine.
What made these wines a national treasure was the way that Burgundians developed the concept of terroir to identify the qualities of their wines in terms of climate and authenticated methods of production to make them distinct. Being a Burgundy wine under the term terroir means it must be centered around the four main grape varieties grown in the region. By the early 20th century, the consumption of wine and the geography of terroir had become fundamental references to French cultural identity, so it makes sense that the region's signature and historical dish is in large part influenced by the wine you use. Aside from the history, my connection to the dish is more closely tied to Julia Child and her story, which is very similar to my grandmother's.
Mom learned how to cook. She actually ran away from home when she was 17 from Germany, and she went to Paris and she enrolled herself in the Sorbonne University and learned how to cook in Paris. About that, but then I saw the movie about Julia Child's history and how she became a household name, and I realized that their lives were so similar in that they both found themselves in a foreign country and a foreign culture with some time on their hands, and that they invested their interest in food, and it ended up becoming a language for them. In addition to the language that they learned to speak, they learned the language of food, and that's how they communicated. Well, I never knew Julia Child, so she never communicated anything to me directly, but my mother communicated her love for us through the food that she made, and a lot of it was French.
The evolution of this dish specifically in America was in part launched by Julia Child's cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published in 1961. Julia Child derived the knowledge for her book from studying in France like my grandma, and her book became famous because of the way it changed cooking habits of women in America. Child's audience had preconceived notions that French cooking was too fancy for their lifestyles, so Julia offered sophistication without French stuffiness or the revolutions of cooking in class in between and ended up hitting a target group of women in 1961. This particular moment of restlessness for a particular cohort stayed at home, including my grandma. And while she was not directly influenced by Child, Julia was very similar to her and her passion for cooking, which influenced my father and aunt as well. On the screen, you're seeing the final product of my dish, beef bourguignon over a bed of mashed potatoes. Not super fancy, not necessarily a peasant's dish, but definitely not anything that would end up in a restaurant, but it was delicious and amazing to taste and cook, and it really brought me closer to my family and my connections to Julia Child as well.